So when documenting all your requirements, you not only have to think about what does a good requirement look like, what are the characteristics and the criteria, what documentation technique to use, but also on how to structure all the things that you are documenting. And this is why we're going to talk about document structures now, and also subsequently providing you some templates. So besides the characteristics of good requirements, there are also characteristics for good requirements documents. And the IEEE standard suggests here, very similar to the actual good requirements, that you pay attention to ambiguity and consistency. So make sure that it's unambiguous and consistent. It requires individual requirements to be unambiguous and consistent. All requirements should be uniquely identifiable, so something like an ID maybe. It also emphasizes modifiability and extendability. So it must be easy to modify and extend the requirements document that you're creating. Should be subject to a version control management as well, so that you have like versions 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 with some way of understanding and tracking back to what changes have been made between different versions, who was responsible, and those things come into this category. Completeness, once again, of course, important. Not just a single requirement needs to be complete in itself, but also the requirements document should contain all requirements. And each requirement must be documented completely, and that may require additional information that also must be present in here. And that includes maybe the required reactions, influential factors, inputs, error and exception cases, quality requirements, structural completeness, and so many more things. What also is required for completeness of a document is labels for figures and tables. Super trivial and simple, but having a lot of figures and tables that are not clearly referenced and not labeled do not really help you. And there should also be a consistent way of referencing and indexing information in the document. Traceability, also important. So not just the traceability for a single requirement, but for the whole document. So what's the relationship between requirements document and other documents, traceability of changes, and so on. As I said, we're going to come back to traceability later in this lecture series. And then, super simple as well, a clear structure. What am I looking at? I would like to understand very easily how is this document structured. It should make sense, like what comes first, what's second, what wraps up this document, where can I find what type of information. So it should be comprehensive and a very clear structure. There are usually, at least in the traditional requirements engineering sense, often two major documents that help you to characterize the type of documents from like a developer perspective and from the user perspective. So there's in German the Lastenheft, which roughly translates to product requirements document, which is written by the customer, and it defines what is expected or has to be provided. And from a legal perspective, you can maybe use it to define a call for bids. So you write down what you want, then you give it to the public and say, I want this, who can buy or like not buy, develop this for me in a certain time frame for this amount of money. Come on, give me some bids. So this is a Lastenheft, what the customer wants. On the other side, you have the so-called Pflichtenheft or scope statement, which is written by the development organization and defines what will be delivered. So you gave me your Lastenheft, I can give you back a Pflichtenheft, which then tells you what you will get. And the Pflichtenheft may exceed, restrict, or modify the expectations from the Lastenheft. Maybe it's shorter because there was a lot of stuff that could not be delivered or is just like outside the scope. It could modify and adapt a few things inside that previous document, or it could just even exceed it. Usually both of those documents are mostly defined by their implications for legal affair and negotiations, but they're still like they serve a purpose. So Lastenheft should not over-constrain the possible solution, should focus on prioritized expectations, while the Pflichtenheft should have a user focus in writing. It should address user requirements, and it typically uses the same techniques for specification as in the Lastenheft. So you don't try to switch like between those. Please note that there are typically requirements that are not described in the Pflichtenheft, for example, internal to the development organization or a higher level of detail and technical aspects. So please keep that in mind when you using those two terms. So more general now, what would a good structure look like? What is the required content that you want to have? First of all, table of content. Every requirement document should contain certain contents like an introduction, general overview, requirements, appendices, index, independent of the concrete and real structure that you will see. Like you have something like an intro, what are we talking about, what's the general overview, the requirements, the core meat of what we're going to do, additional information in appendix, and then an index. This is like a very, very rough structure. What do you get in the introduction? Contains information about the entire document. What are you reading here? What are we preparing you to read? Provides an overview of the system. What's the system supposed to do? Addresses also the following issues like the purpose, why was the document created. It also details the system coverage as well as the stakeholders, like listing all the stakeholders and the relevant information. Also gives you definitions, acronyms, and abbreviations that could be relevant to understand the rest of the document. So when we're all talking about requirements engineering, it makes sense that we all have the same definition of requirements. Or if you're participating in our sustainability course, it makes sense that we all have a common understanding of what sustainability means. So clearly define those things first, and you also do the same thing with acronyms and abbreviations. References could also be part of the introduction or more commonly going to the appendix. And it also gives an overview that outlines the content and structure of the remainder of the document. Usually you find this at the end of the introduction. Then we're done with the introduction. Next comes the general overview. Information that increase the understandability of the requirements are provided here. Also operational information, not really the administrative and management stuff. And it also addresses the following issues. It gives you information about the system environment. How is the system embedded in its environment? We talked about system context and the boundaries, if you remember this from the last lectures. And it also defines the system boundary and the context boundary. Architecture description, operational interfaces of the system, additional information pertaining to the architecture like storage limitations could be relevant here, just general overview. And then you move forward to the system functionalities. So it gives you an idea of what are the functionalities of the system, what are the tasks of the system. Could be good to use cases here. Then you also provide an overview on the users and the target audience. Who will use that system? State each of the target audience separately. So don't mesh all of them together because that might give different requirements. You're also having a look at constraints, everything that is not documented elsewhere that poses a constraint on the system. And also assumptions that you're working on. What are the general assumptions about the system context? For example, that certain functionality is out of scope, either due to budget reasons or any other potential reason that might be applicable here. And then we have the remainder. This we're gonna cut very short now, but it's actually the main part of your document, the requirements. Contains the functional and non-functional requirements of your systems, and also the constraints that might not be part of the previous section. So the huge big chunk that we'll fill using the documentation techniques that come in the later videos. And then the appendix, where you have additional information that completes the document. So something that is relevant for the document, but might make the main part of the document unreadable if you include everything there. So if you have 100 interface inputs, it might make sense to highlight them or list them as examples or parts of them in the main part of a certain section, and then say, look, all the other, 90 input parameters are listed later in the appendix where you can just look them up. It might make the whole document easier to read. And then you might also have standards, conventions, and background information included in the document before you have the index with the table of context, the directories, but also the references. Another important aspect or part of each document is a so-called glossary, and could be like quite self-explanatory, but in terms of requirements engineering, we would like to take a few minutes to go a little bit into detail with respect to the glossary. So first of all, why do you need it? Pretty simple, because there are some technical terms that are ambiguous and it needs to be properly defined, and where you need to explain them in more detail. For example, interfaces such user interfaces, Java interfaces, or API. What do you mean with an interface? Same goes for service. Is it a web service, or are you using it as a generic term to describe provided functionalities? So what are you talking about? And in addition, some terms may not be known by all stakeholders, so you need a place where you can explain or like have some space to write down a proper understanding or a proper definition for all of them. And then there are some terms that may be specific to a project that also need to be written down somewhere. Example could be model-driven architecture or interoperability testing framework, some things that need a little bit more explanation so that everyone is on the same page. So the purpose is the definition of the meaning of terms that increases the understandability and also aims to avoid misunderstandings and different interpretations. It should use unified language or unify the language between the stakeholders, so it should help to do that. And the glossary entries should also be written in such a way that you can reuse them later on potentially for other projects that are like similar. So for example, you're a company that's often working on software projects in the healthcare sector. There will be terms that will come back again and again and again. So you can use the glossary across projects, while on the other hand, some of those terms might be really project specific. There might be some definitions or terms that are even universal across projects and standardized using, for example, the IEEE standard glossary. So you can look up some stuff there if that helps you to make your life easier. This is just like one of those resources that we want to give you so that you know where to look and get started when you are a requirements engineer. Besides the intuitive explanation what a glossary is, we also have a proper definition for you. A glossary is a collection of technical terms that are part of a language terminology. A glossary defines the specific meaning of each of those terms. A glossary can additionally contain references to related terms as well as examples that explain the terms. So pretty much what we just discussed previously, just in more formal words. So there are different elements to a glossary, like context, specific technical terms, abbreviation and acronyms, everyday concepts with special meanings in the given context, synonyms, same meaning, different terms, homonyms, different meanings, same term. So all of those information that will help to get to this goal of having a unified language for the whole document. There are also certain rules, like you should have a central management, only one valid glossary at a time, not multiple versions. The responsibilities must be clear. Who is the individual who is responsible for the glossary? How do you make sure that you avoid confusions and inconsistencies? Who's maintaining the glossary? Because that's also like an important and huge part, because the glossary is a living document until you're done. It must be maintained throughout the whole life cycle until the project is done, but even afterwards, for documentation purposes, it is an important piece of information. And just think about how we elicited requirements. There we considered the idea of system archaeology or reusing existing requirements, which then may rely on those glossaries that you need to understand them. So essentially the glossary remains valid and important as long as the underlying document is relevant and important. And make sure that the glossary is commonly accessible so that everyone in the project can also have a look at this and use it to understand all the terms listed there and to create this unified language for the whole document. There's also the aspect of obligatory parts of, or like the fact that the glossary is obligatory. Only the terms from the glossary are to be used, not others. If additional synonyms are available, they are not to be used because they are not in the glossary. What's not there cannot be used. It also should include sources. If a source for a term is available, it should be part of a glossary. We have in our sustainability lecture a paper that shows that at some point there were more than 100 definitions of the term circular economy. Which of those definitions are you using and why? And it helps you to avoid discussions about terms. Make sure that the glossary is agreed upon between stakeholders. The stakeholders should agree on the terminology that is used and, for example, the sources for certain definitions, which are applicable in a certain context. And it should have a consistent structure. That means all entries must have the same structure. So think about something like a template structure that you can use for everything that goes there. That already then leads us to the glossary structure. Each entry in a glossary should have the same general structure. A good glossary structure contains at least, this is not like complete list, but at least the name of the term, the definition of the term. Are there any synonyms? Are there related terms? And are there good examples, or sometimes counter-examples also make sense? That's a lot for just a term, but it helps to unify the used language and get everyone a shared understanding. Here's one example for something like very simple. So the term is a route. How do you define a route? The specific distance of a direction from a starting point to a destination. There are synonyms and related terms, and there are examples here illustrated by a Google Maps route to get someone from a starting point to an end point. But this is just like a random example. How do you create a glossary? You start with a definition of the structure of the glossary. Then you provide initial entries and definition for all glossary entries. Then you ask the stakeholders to check the definitions. They should provide their own definitions in case of differences or if they have to add something. Also help you to identify missing entries. And then subsequently you update and align definitions in the glossary and make the glossary available to everyone. Ideally online, but that depends a little bit on your project. And while this now looks like a very linear process that you just start once and then you're done, as already said, like this is more like an iterative approach because you update and keep refining the glossary, so it's a living document, so it's more iterative approach where you go back and forth, essentially in circles all the time until the document has reached the end of its life cycle.